So we're going to start now with our afternoon work session titled Translation as Unconditional Hospitality, Asymptotic Task, and Decision Beyond Rules. We have Pablo, then Matthew, and Begoña. And we're going to listen to these presentations in a row. And then we're going to have one or two rounds of questions. No? So, Pablo.
Well, thank you. I won't repeat my apologies from the other day, so that you take them into account. So, I begin to read. Ideally, or maybe better, ethically considered, translation is an opening to the other. It is a harboring and a hosting of the other. It is an opening to and a hosting of the other language to begin with. But for that very reason, it is an opening to and a hosting of the other that speaks this language in this language. And for that reason, too, it is an othering of the language to which the other language and speaker is translated. An othering, too, of the one who translates. In what follows, I will try to propose a certain model that may suggest a way of considering the operation of this opening and othering. Yet I will begin from an apparently opposite side. It has always seemed to me that addressing the problem of translation may contribute to the theory of decision, and conversely, that the latter offers a suitable frame for that problem. Decision, I mean, as an instance that refers to world as such, whether it be Entscheidung, in the wording of Carl Schmitt, or Entschlossenheit, according to Heidegger's tenor. Both concepts allude to a primary shaping of or disclosure of world. Either restitution of world as order from the total suspension of orderliness, or an original uncovering of new or furtive, latent, unthought of meanings as contexts and dimensions of existence. In one sense or another, decision is here a sovereign act, an act of the sovereign. And this allegedly pertains to the essence of decision, for it is the inauguration of an entirely new series of causes and events. In this sense, decision has analogically the character of a divine act. According to this character, Schmitt can explain the concept of the sovereign in theological political terms. Souverän ist, wer über den Ausnahmezustand entscheidet. Heidegger, for his part, tends to undermine this theological political connection, arguing that decision presupposes a call of conscience that brings back Dasein from its entanglement in inauthentic existence toward the appropriation of his own being. But this original act of appropriation is a fundamental, unfounded leap into existence, an Ursprung, which has, to no matter its primary inducement, an inaugural character. Allow me to say, an ontological, and if we think of the destiny, the Geschick of the community, of the people, of the folk, even an ontologic political sense. Although you may substitute being for God, decision retains its authoritative trait, the trait of the sovereign, which seems to be indelible. In order to fulfill her task, the translator has to take decisions. Should the translator as a decision taker be thought of as an instance of sovereignty? But what is it that the translator decides? For she actually has to decide at the moment when she decides. Furthermore, what is to decide in the case of translation? The answer seems easy and simple. You have to decide which word or sequence of words, which kind of rewording might render in another language according to a different code, the text, the passage you are working on in a way that may be consistent with it. But at this critical moment, you feel a kind of impediment, no matter how minimal it could be. You hesitate. And this hesitation is the truth of the translator's decision. For that reason, if a theory of decision is in some way linked to a theory of translation, it would be a theory that tends to reduce decision and sovereignty to its 0 degree, and which, for the same reason, suspends decision's inaugural power as the first cause in a chain of causes and effects, leaving at the same time its agent in parenthesis. If decision suspends every state of play at the moment it is taken, the decisions involved in translation suspend the suspension. This is so because to translate is to decide at every moment. But if translating is to decide at every moment, this entails that translating is a constant hesitation. You may see it this way. To translate is to decide at any moment the connection between two heterogeneous series, say the series of meaning and the series of signs, the series of the spirit and the series of the letter. It is the heterogeneity of this series that imposes wavering. And this vacillation does not only hover over signs and meanings, but suspends, defers, silently interrupts the trustful relation of the subject to herself. In this sense, there's probably no subject of these decisions, which means that a theory of translation is also a critical theory of the subject, a theory of the declination, the interruption, the deferral of the subject. I think that this predicament is at last not essentially different to the situation or the condition of the one who writes, of the one who wrote in the first place what you or me are committed to translate. To write is also to hesitate at any moment. Hesitation allows a blind spot to emerge, a spot that is the possibility of signifying, that moves the text that you are writing, that you may be translating. The dawn of meaning is like the onset of a world, although not in the Schmittian or Heideggerian sense. It is, to use a term of Lucretius, of illustrious Epicurean ancestry, a Kleineman, a swerve, and for that reason it is sheer contingency, which amounts to say that it is a feeble flash amidst the night of meaninglessness. Translation, just as speaking, as writing, listening, touching, reaching out, and loving, may help the light not to die out without a trace. This is perhaps what all of these relations have in common, for all of them are relations to something other in its very otherness. In the case of translation, it helps incipient dawning of light to linger insofar as it lets itself to be determined by the untranslatable, the otherness that is its irrevocable concern, without yielding to despair. And there is good reason for experiencing hopelessness. To translate the untranslatable, to render it as untranslatable, would be to render account of the Kleineman, that is to say, of meaning in statu nascendi, in the uncertain and unspecifiable moment of its wavering advent. The stratagem not to fall into despair is to hesitate. It is not so different from the experience you may use when you do not know precisely what to say in a given pressing circumstance. If it has some sense to state that speaking is already translating, then there is also an analogy to draw between translating and stuttering. I was talking about a heterogeneity of series the translator is bound to confront and to solve. Let's look at some instances that may not be merely unique, for they lurk wherever one sets out with the intention of articulating a concept of translation. Indeed, it may be particularly interesting for a critical examination of translation to pay attention to those renderings that, so to say, put the reference to meaning between brackets and operate in a somewhat mechanical way on the level of the signifier, of the letter, of the material marks. Take, for example, transliterations. In such cases, you have a template, a table of equivalences. Think of transliteration from Greek to Latin alphabet. And you just have to make the conventional and regular substitutions in order to have the text in a legible appearance. Although, if you don't know anything of Greek, you are unable to understand what became legible for you. I am particularly interested in these mismatches between what is legible and what is understandable. Legibility should entail comprehension, but here, where a mechanical operation allows reading without understanding anything if you don't know the language in which the source text was produced, the situation is absolutely different. I think that this mechanical operation is very illustrative of what goes on in translation. At last, what I would provisionally call the mechanical moment is inextricable from any translating exercise, no matter how intensely the latter is magnetized by the pole of meaning. I'm pointing to a paradox that passes in silence and that is perhaps crucial as seen from every point of view. If on the one hand translation demands a stringent scruple in view of the letter and the spirit, a scruple that distinguishes translation from common speech with the marks of labor, attention, and conscience, and that frequently, or rather at every turn, imposes on it the repeated exercise of decision, it isn't possible to translate perhaps without that moment, that mechanical moment occurring, without inadvertence, absent-mindedness, and a certain loss of oneself. And this would be the decision as such. Now, allow me to suggest the model I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. I'm afraid that this will sound as a mere fancy, but I'm inclined to conceive of translation as a paradigm of occasionalism. Occasionalism is an age-long doctrine whose first inception took place in the Arab world around the 9th and 10th century among the Asharit Mutakallimun in dispute with the Aristotelian falasifa, that is, theology against philosophy, to say it roughly and without further precisions. The outstanding representative of this tradition was the Sunni theologian Al-Ghazali, born in the middle of the 11th century, of our 11th century, I mean. Apart from other important works, he authored The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Takhafut al-Falasifa. In this famous book, which was responded later by Averroes with an incoherence of the incoherence, Takhafut al-Takhafut, Al-Ghazali promoted occasionalism in order to defend God's working of miracles. God is the only cause of everything. Creatures have no power to bring things to happen. Wherever an action, an effect occurs, it is God that acts. The doctrine lasted. Centuries later, 6 to be sure, it had a spectacular rebirth. This is a kind of translation too. A spectacular rebirth among the Cartesians, starting from Descartes himself, who defended the thesis of a constant creation of the world by himself, of the world by God, and had a tough issue trying to explain the mind-body connection in view of the absolute heterogeneity of the thinking substance and the extended substance. Louis de la Forge, Géraud de Cordemois, and the penetrating Arnold Hulinx contributed fundamentally to this rebirth, but it is Nicolas Malebranche who deserves the title of the major European occasionalist. I quote, "There is only one true cause because there is only one true God. The nature or power of each thing is nothing but the will of God. All natural causes are not true causes, but only occasional causes." In these terms, end of quote, Malebranche presents the central thesis of occasionalism in his fundamental work, The Search for Truth. There is no secret force in bodies that could be communicated from one to another. There is no secret power, there is no power in finite spirits that would make matter move. Wherever a bodily fact occurs, or wherever an affection or notion arouses, it is God that intervenes, establishing the connection between one and the other, hunger and intake, blow and pain, desire, drive and action. The central idea is that you cannot speak of a true cause if you cannot conceive of a necessary connection between it and its effect. And the only being that has the power to produce this connection is the Supreme Being, the one and only efficacious agent that creates everything that is, and who indispensably brings about everything that may happen to things created and among those things. Consequently, any relation between natural, finite things, including humans, is merely contingent. To be the occasional cause of something is just to have a tangential relation to this something. You may say it otherwise. It's only God that can decide and who actually and always decides. He, with a capital H, is the sovereign. Finite creatures encounter one another accidentally, hesitantly, undecidingly. They may, if they are able to think, recognize firm regularities and continuities in the behavior of phenomena, but they should not dare to attribute such regularities to the power of some hidden forces and things. From the strict point of view of the limited condition, the world should appear to them thoroughly as contingency. And this is the perspective from which the translator adumbrates her task and her object. Of course, she cannot have the Malebranchian unshakable faith in an efficacious, omnipotent God that would assist her in the usual urgencies of translation. Thinking of a God that decides Every connection between such heterogeneous series as thoughts, phenomena, facts and deeds, marks and meanings, cannot but be a hasty hypothesis, an outlandish idea. Yet what if this hypothesis, this idea, were somehow intricately implicated in the translating operation? Think of a minor god, a little devil perhaps. He with a lowercase h, he, she, or it would not be a sovereign. It, she, or he would be just a guess. In fact, it would be a deus ex machina, the alter ego, the other of the translation to whom she turns in order to fulfill translation's task and ethical mandate, the opening to the other. I skip a paragraph. Translators have a saint patron, Jerome, Hieronymus of Stridon, to whom we owe the Vulgata, the translation of the Bible into Latin. Non verbum e verbos et sensum exprimere de senso is his ascetic rule. Quote, for I myself not only admit but freely proclaim that in translating from the Greek, except in the case of the Holy Scriptures, where even the order of the words is a mystery, this is a parenthesis, I render sense for sense and not word for word, end of quote. Of course, I have to omit here the parenthesis, which complicates a bit the doctrine. With the God of translators, it is different. There is no possibility to know in advance what is word, for meaning always sounds a letter, and there is no fixed criterion to decide the sense of a word or of a sequence of words, for the letter always disturbs meaning. So the God of the translators, the occasionalist deus ex machina, who's in fact the ghost in the machine, is the one who comes to the aid at any given moment of the task of translating. This God has to link letter and spirit, word and ghost. Call it genius, unconscious fluke, gods and good luck or whatever. In fact, it's just the ability of making a decision of hesitation and vice versa. This would be the translating machine. The translator's glory and her misery at the same time is that she decides undeciding, creates uncreating, that is abdicating the sovereignty that is granted her precisely because it's up to her to decide at every moment. And any moment is a narrow passage through which the other may come. Thank you.
Right, I'm going to basically just give you a story, which is uncannily quite like the story of a writer-translator inhabiting the kinds of difficulties and quandaries that Pablo has just described. It's a story drawn from these texts, among others, and a story about this guy, John Dryden, but of course not only about him, as he is not only himself, because he lived in dialogue with other people around him. Here's Afra Ben, for instance, and because he was a translator, his identity is also made up of, comes from, is interlaced with that of the people he translated, his Ovid, his Virgil. And so he himself is a complex figure. Here are many Drydens I'll be talking about. In giving you a kind of translational representation of him, I'm going to try to flesh out in practice some of the points I presented theoretically on Monday. So for instance, something I'm interested in is how are we bringing text into this room? Is it helpful to think of the processes that we are ourselves engaged in as processes of translation? Does it change anything about what we do if we think of them in that way? Secondly, what kind of language community are we constructing for ourselves by doing that? So that if we take seriously the argument elaborated by Andres from Humboldt and that intellectual tradition about the shaping influence of language on the way we think, then that's something that doesn't just apply to the communities and languages we're talking about. It applies to our own community, and we should be paying particular attention to our own linguistic medium. We should be enriching that with the material we translate into this space, just as translators have done and are doing in their translations into other languages in other contexts throughout history. And actually, one of the there are various kind of points of contact between what I'm going to be talking about, but one of them is the repetition, actually, kind of uncannily close of some words that were key in what Pablo's just been saying. So, for instance, the word open and the word speak, and Dryden is really interested in what both those words might mean. So a bit about Dryden. He lived through a time of great political upheaval and threat, so 1631 to 1700, the Civil War, the so-called Protectorate under Cromwell, which is kind of a totalitarian regime in some respects, the restoration of King Charles II, the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1689, which installed an Anglican instead of a Roman Catholic monarch. So Dryden was navigating these political complexities of these turbulent and variously oppressive times as he was writing and translating. He wrote a lot of poems, especially political satires. He wrote a lot of plays. He was a really active restoration dramatist. And he was engaged in a lot of translation, mainly from Latin, but a bit from Greek as well, Ovid, Juvenal, and especially Virgil. And he wrote in a medium that is really continuous between Latin and English. So he spoke and read and wrote Latin as easily as he wrote English. You may remember on Monday, I talked about him translating Chaucer into English and the way that that created a border around what counted as English. And in all his writing, he is really concerned with the question of what is going to work in his language community. So he does think of himself as kind of building something called English as a medium. But it's also a really complicated issue because he is, in doing that, he's continually bringing Latin terms and rhetorical figures into his writing. So it's an English that he would have thought of probably as being continually enriched from Latin, but because of that, you've got this sort of oscillation around the border. There's the kind of establishment and dissolving of a border happening the whole time in the interaction between what he's writing and the Latin that he's working with. In fact, it seems to me that what he's doing is not very far from a German Romantic kind of translation program, even though that's not at all how he's normally seen. There are a couple of ways into the aspects of his work that I want to present to you. And the first is that the culmination of his whole life as both a poet and a translator was his translation of the works of Virgil, which came out in 1697. And yet, after all that labor, what he said about this translation in the prefatory material to the volume is this: I have done great wrong to Virgil in the whole translation. And this first struck me when I did a load of work on Dryden about 10 years ago, when I was writing a book called The Poetry of Translation. And it's stayed with me since as something to think about. And as we'll see, it connects with things we've been exploring over the last few days about the so-called impossibility of translation. The other way into what I want to say is that Dryden is still a figure who is known, or rather known of, both in translation studies and in Anglophone poetry translation. You see him referred to, he's made to stand for something. But what he is made to stand for is a radical simplification, even distortion of what he said and did. So here I feel myself to be maybe a bit in dialogue with what Pramesh said about uncovering a different potential in that text by Soga that he was reading on Monday, and also maybe a little bit with Baba's translation practice that we encountered a little while ago. Basically, I want to translate a more complex version of Dryden into our discourse so that he can join in our conversations in more interesting ways. So the simplified Dryden is known for having said this. In his translation of Virgil, he wanted to make Virgil speak such English as he would himself have spoken if he'd been born in England and in this present age. And this is usually taken to mean that he espoused a free and fluent domesticating translation strategy or style. That's how Venuti, we heard a bit about Venuti in Andy's presentation earlier, and that's how Venuti uses him, for instance, and other translation studies people follow that line. The second famous pronouncement is this, that he surveyed the field of translation And he said, all translation may be reduced to these three heads: metaphrase, which is more or less word-for-word translation; paraphrase, which is more or less sense-for-sense translation; and imitation, which is a freer kind of rewriting. And this is taken to be a kind of confident, almost imperialist organization of the field. Here are the different types, and once you've grasped them, you've basically mapped the whole enterprise of translation. And so I want to explore and complicate both these statements a bit. So first, the aim to make Virgil speak such English as he would have spoken, etc. That sounds as though it might be a confident and individualistic utterance. Here am I, Dryden, making this pronouncement, and I can enter into another individual called Virgil, and I can ventriloquize him. I can extract him from Rome and from Latin and make him speak English as though cultural difference did not exist. But actually, several poet translators other than Dryden had made similar statements over the preceding decades and meant slightly different things by them. So there was a live question about what was involved in this claim to be constructing an authorial figure and writing in a way that's suitable for that figure to be attached to in your language. So first of all, we have this French translator, Segret, wanting to give or write the Aeneid in the way Virgil would have done if he'd been a subject of Louis XIV. And then we have an earlier English translator of just one book of the Aeneid, where you get this. So you've got the emphasis on being a subject in the French quote, the emphasis on being a man of the nation, but a man of this age, this kind of updating emphasis, which there is later on in Dryden too. So these pre-echoes complicate the idea of enabling an author to speak and complicates what it is to be English, because here we have different translators with different ideas of what it is to make an author speak, and different languages or different kinds of languages for him to speak in. So fast forwarding to Dryden's utterance, what might, if you look at it by itself, what might seem like Dryden's own voice, Dryden's own assertion, is in fact intertextually mingled with and debating with these other voices. Now, that quote about making Virgil speak, when Dryden says that, that's kind of quite late on in his career. And he was, of course, aware of these earlier translators well before he himself said the thing about making Virgil speak, and well before he even started translating the Aeneid. And interestingly, his first encounter, his first engagement with these ideas about, what you do in translating is make someone speak, is a pretty hostile one. And this is in 1680, in the preface to his first published book of translations, Ovid's Epistles, which was a collaborative volume. Dryden only did 3 of the epistles, and a large group of other poet translators, including Aphra Behn, who was the only woman writer in the volume, did the rest. Dryden pulled this book together in collaboration with an enterprising young publisher, Jacob Tonson, who spotted a new market for poetic translations from the classics. And both Dryden and his collaborators went on to do several more books with this publisher. So an important thing we need to see here is that we need to generalize that plurality that we've discovered in the idea of enabling Virgil to speak. The translation scene when Dryden was writing was very multiple. He was collaborating with other people, he was debating ideas with them, and he was reading lots of other translations into English and also into Italian and French. So if we imagine a picture of translation, a scene of translation, it's not just Dryden and a Latin book, but Dryden with many books in various languages open around him, and the voices of other people with whom he is in debate. Now, one of these interlocutors was the poet Cowley, Abraham Cowley, who'd done some very free versions of the Greek odes of Pindar. And here's what Dryden says about that work. So first of all, he says, okay, Pindar is so difficult to translate that the only thing you can do is imitation. You can't do a word-for-word translation. And in order to make him speak English, you have to do this imitation thing, not translating. And then he goes on to say, this is the greatest wrong which can be done to the memory and reputation of the dead. It's a really one of the things about Dryden is that his critical language is is always turning back on itself, and it's very mobile. So you've got one page in which he seems to say, okay, I can completely understand and appreciate what Cowley's doing. This is why he does it. And then you turn the page and he says, this is the greatest wrong which can be done to the memory and reputation of the dead. And obviously this is a kind of big pre-echo of what he says about his own work later on, and I'll come back to that. Let's look now at this idea of imitation as Dryden distinguishes it, or in my view does not actually distinguish it from paraphrase and metaphrase. So this is a bit that is reproduced in lots of translation studies anthologies, as Dryden's typology of translation. But what really interests me is the way that if you read it, it doesn't work as a typology at all, because as soon as each category is announced, it blurs into the next one, or it's shown to be inadequate in some way. So even if you look at the first one, metaphrase, or turning an author word by word and line by line from one language to another, and then then he wants to come up with an example. And what he says is, thus, or near this manner, was Horace's Art of Poetry translated by Ben Jonson. So he can't even come up with one satisfactory example of this category that he's announced. He can only come up with an example that is sort of kind of represents it. And then as you read on, you've got paraphrase. But if you look at the way it is characterized and how that blurs into the way in which imitation characterizes, you've got this series from not being so strictly followed, being allowed to be amplified, not altered, but then you've got varying, and then you've got forsaking. So you've got this kind of gradation of, this kind of slide of being freer and freer, which kind of unravels the categorization of paraphrase into paraphrase and imitation in the very act of it being announced, I think. And then what happens as soon as he tries to take these categories and apply them to his own work, he finds that they don't fit. So what he says at the end of this preface is, I'm ready to acknowledge that I've transgressed the rules which I have given. And he keeps on saying this, so it's a complete characteristic of really pretty much every act of translation that he engages in. He says, well, okay, I've got these categories for describing translation, but they don't fit what I myself am doing. So Juvenal and Persius betwixt the paraphrase and imitation, and then the Aeneid betwixt metaphrase and paraphrase. And actually, it's not just him. So the same, interestingly, happens with the presentation of Afra Bain's translation in the prefatory material to this collaborative book of Ovid epistles. So you've got this, first of all, in the preface, you've got this very gendered characterization of her. Afra Bain's version, he says, is in the way of imitation only, because the author, who is of the fair sex, understood not Latin. But then when you turn to the translation itself in the book, it's not presented as an imitation, it's presented as a paraphrase. So again, you've got this sort of complete failure to apply the announced categories. Afra Bain uses the freedom of not knowing Latin. Really interestingly, she uses that freedom to add quite a lot to the speech of Ovid's Oenone. She introduces a critique of sexual politics and celebrity culture, which is really kind of apt to her own environment in the world of Restoration drama, and there's a lot that could be said about that. But what, in fact, I'm not going to do that, but what, in fact, I want to focus on here is the way in which this group of writers, in them, you can see this exploratory looseness about what counts as translation. You've got different poet translators trying out different styles and making different kinds of claim for them. It's not clear in this environment what translation should be like and should do. And there seems to be a recognition that the relationship between the practice of translation and the terms for describing it is problematic, that the practice and the description are never going to quite match up. So let's turn now to Dryden's own practice in his translation of Virgil. And this means we're jumping 10 or 15 years forward from the moment I've just been focusing on. And of course, both his thought and his writing develop in that period. But there are threads that remain constant. And what I want to look at in particular is his idea that his translation of Virgil operates between metaphrase and paraphrase, i.e. between a kind of word for wording and a more expansive translation practice. So what is that? What does that mean? Dryden was inclined to think about translation as a process of opening, and so this touches what Pablo was saying a moment ago. This word opening and this idea of translation as a process of opening goes back to Reformation translations of the Bible, which often presented themselves with this word opening, as opening the meaning of the text for believers, so that the Bible's teachings could then open out into the living of their lives. This becomes a really important strand in thinking about translation in 17th century Britain, and it's also part of the story of why the word paraphrase, which starts off in a religious context, It comes into English through a translation of Erasmus's paraphrase of the New Testament. And from there, this word paraphrase becomes a key word for thinking about literary translation. And the idea of opening goes on the same journey. I did all the kind of scholarly bedrock for that is in that book, The Poetry of Translation, from a few years ago. Dryden inherits this way of thinking. And for him, it becomes both especially attractive and especially problematic when he's translating and thinking about Virgil. Because what he loves about Virgil is that he feels the poetry is full of secrets. Virgil has 1,000 secret beauties, and he says the same thing on many occasions. What he means by that is basically two kinds of thing. One is that there's an implicit political relevance in the text, so he's thinking of sort of coded praise of Augustus, that kind of thing. But the other is the nuance, ambiguity, emotional suggestiveness of Virgil's poetry. You know, what's suggested by the fact that this particular word is used here, what's suggested by the fact that Aeneas says this to Dido at this particular moment. So it's everything that's kind of connoted or implied by the positioning of the words, and he thinks of Virgil as being particularly rich in that respect, as indeed he probably is, and that's what he loves in him. All this is the sort of thing that people, I guess, still tend to have in mind when they use sonic, phonetic words for talking about poetry, so that when they talk about the voice of poetry or a poet's voice. And all this is also quite a large part of what Dryden had in mind when he was talking about wanting to make Virgil speak. So over time, he becomes happier with this idea that what he's doing in translating is finding a voice, getting a voice from the text. And part of the reason why that is he's reflecting on this process of interpretation that is kind of hearing. It's hard not to reach for words like hearing, is hearing the nuances of the poetry and expanding them in the translation. You see the problem. If what's wonderful about Virgil is that he's full of secrets, then as a translator you want to show that to your reader. But as soon as you open up the secrets to your readers, then they're not secrets anymore, so it's not wonderful anymore. Here you can begin to see why, for Dryden, translation necessarily oscillates between modes. And also we can begin to see the roots of his self-criticism. If a translation doesn't open up Virgil's secrets, then it's not really getting at what matters in Virgil, it's not making that available to the readers, it's not really doing what the work of translation should be. But at the same time, if it does open up those secrets, then it's not really offering you anything that you can call Virgil anymore. You know, it's not providing you with a text that has secrets in it, so it's doing damage at the same time. Let's look at how this works in practice. Here is the Latin edition that Dryden mainly used. And you can already see that it's in itself a multiple text. So you've got Virgil's Latin verse. Next to it, there's a Latin prose paraphrase by a 17th century French Jesuit editor, Rueus, or Charles de la Rue, with explanatory notes at the bottom. And this multiple text was not the only text from which Dryden was translating in this moment of translating Virgil. He also used other editions, other translations into French and Italian as well as English, and other reference sources, dictionaries, history books, and so on. And he talked to his friends about it. And I've tried to symbolize, obviously I couldn't adequately represent all this circumambient textuality, so I tried to symbolize it with a background image pasted from our Institute's program, as perhaps you've recognized those books coming together. In my view, it's really important to see that translation always involves plural textualities. Many texts flow into the moment of translation, and translation also generates multiple textuality. That's why I've got this phrase, prismatic translation, the Prismatic Jane Eyre project, but also the general theoretical book, Prismatic Translation, that includes essays by Adriana and Kaja that's coming out in the autumn. We try to kind of think about translation in this way, as coming from a multiple place and generating a multiplicity of texts. And Dryden is a really sort of good instance of this. So let's look in detail a little bit. Nusquam tuta fides, so something like nowhere is faith safe, nowhere is faith secure. Well, what I just want to show you is that you've got Virgil's Latin, You've got the paraphrase into slightly different Latin, and then you've got this explanation in the note at the bottom. So what he's looking at is not just one text, what he's looking at is this triple textuality. And he then has to imagine his way into this multiple textuality, and in doing so, he conjures up the thing he translates. And that conjuring up of the thing he translates is also the beginning of translation. You can't ever say where translation starts. Where's the moment of beginning to read? Where does the moment of beginning to read? Where does the reading become translating, etc.? You can't ever find the beginning there. But in this process, Dryden metaphorically somehow hears something that he thinks of as a voice that he feels that he wants to enable to speak in English. And what I've done here is try to, you can sort of do this and not do this, and here actually my own, here I'm sort of performing the non-fitting of the categories to the translated text, which is to say, looking at this material, you can say, okay, here are words that correspond to Virgil's words. So, Virgil's got the word faith, and that it is nowhere, so that kind of goes into faithless, and you can kind of say that, okay, if this was a word-for-word translation, it might have the word faithless in it. And then you've got these purple things that, you think, okay, probably that's more towards being paraphrased. But then on the other hand, if you look at the ones that I've sort of half-heartedly given in purple and then underlined in red, it's not on earth and it's not in the skies. Well, that's just another way of saying nowhere, really, isn't it? And then if you look at justice is fled and truth is now no more, well, that's an expansion, but then it's kind of very close. It's a sort of rewording of what there is in the explanatory note by Rueus at the bottom. So you can kind of, there are two things. So one of the things I think is you can look at this and you go, gosh, the fact of it being between metaphrase and paraphrase is really just, it's a kind of literal thing. There are bits of it that you can say, okay, that's metaphrase, and there are bits of it that you can say that's paraphrase, and the translation is oscillating between them. There are two modes of translation running together at the same text. So you can kind of make that move. But also in making that move, you have to see that these categories of metaphrase and paraphrase don't really fit anything. This is a bit like what Pablo was saying about there being no given definition of word-for-word translation, because anything you point to, you could characterize as sort of blurring between those two categories. So what he's doing then, I think, here is translating from the note. So you've got this process. This is a process of opening at work. It's partly in sort of, let's see how it goes on. And so with the same caveats as for the previous slides, there are bits that are more like paraphrase and bits that are more like metaphrase, but you could kind of dispute that. So what's happening here, I think, is that he's rerouting what he discovers to be the energies, the voice of Virgil's text, into the different medium of his English couplets, where there is a bit more space in the verse, and where there have to be rhymes. And in thinking about this, we can recall Andres' presentation, I can't remember if it was on Wednesday or Monday, about the different aspects of poetry that poetry translators can focus on. So partly what Dryden is doing is finding equivalents that work in English for rhetorical patterns that there are in Latin. So the verbs at the start of the lines here, I saved and I took, correspond to verbs that in the Latin are at the beginning and the end of the same line. So you've got a kind of switching of rhetorical figures from epanalepsis into anaphora. He's also doing a semantic thing. He's opening out the meaning of Virgil's lines. And he's also doing an emotional thing, because in doing that, he's hearing, sympathizing with, giving heft to Dido's pain. So Virgil, with his characteristic reticence, leaves his readers to think for themselves that Aeneas is being a traitor. And he leaves it to readers to think for themselves that when Dido, says, okay, I got him to share my kingdom, she's not actually saying, and I got him to share my bed, but that's there implicitly. And Dryden can't help but sort of notice that and want to make it explicit. And the fact that he has to come up with a rhyme sort of collaborates in this process. So, what I want to bring into the room from this is just, some exemplification, some words, opening, paraphrase, making speak, but an exemplification, sort of fleshing out or adding texture to how those words can work in practice. So to show you that instance, but also to show you the fact that this is an instance in which the practice is always eluding the explanatory frames that can be brought to bear on it. And I guess this chimes with what Pablo was saying as well. And that's because translation is always slipping through both the poet's and the critic's grasp. So I think that as a translator, you can imagine him saying, I haven't quite translated it yet, I need a few more words. And then he comes out with a few more words and it says, oh God, the moment of translation has gone by. It's not really a translation anymore because there's too much there. Do you see? You've got this sort of continual sort of oscillation around the thing that can't ever be quite right. You need to paraphrase in order to translate, in order to open up the meaning. But as soon as you're paraphrasing, you worry that you're not translating anymore. Dryden moves into paraphrase in order to try to grasp Virgil's voice as it speaks through Dido's voice. But in doing that, he obviously fractures the text and cannot but know and lament that that's what he's doing. I also wanted to offer some kind of very brief reflection on the relation between my own language practices and Dryden's. So Dryden obviously translated Virgil, and I've been giving you a version of Dryden translating Virgil. Dryden wrote about translation, I've been talking about Dryden writing about translation. So exactly the same caveats apply to what I've been doing as he applied to what he was doing. My critical account of him doesn't exactly fit any more than his critical account of himself does. My translation of him is considerably less adequate, no doubt, than his translation of Virgil. It's certainly shorter. Yet somehow I don't feel so bad about it as he did. Why is that? I think it's partly because I'm just not a very moral person, but it's also because I guess I'm not making such a big claim, which is to say I'm not pretending to offer you the whole of Dryden, just a 20-minute account of him. What I'm engaged in isn't translation, it's just a talk given in the context of contemporary academia. And yet, my talk has in fact also been full of translational moments, as I define them on Monday, full of moments of quotation and paraphrase, full of moments where I've spoken on his behalf, imposing an equivalence between my utterance and his. And I think we can't stop doing that. So you can look at that and say, oh, I shouldn't do that. But I mean, you can't stop doing that. We can't stop doing that as intellectuals and critics. We can't stop speaking on behalf any more than translators can stop thinking they've found the meaning, or any more than Dryden could stop trying to, or for a moment feeling that he'd heard and remade Virgil's voice. But I think for me, sort of doing this kind of thing, seeing those moments as translation, rather than seeing them as, I don't know, a bit of meta-language or something like that. Seeing them as translation helps me, and perhaps helps us, to maintain that same complex attitude about them that he did. And I think what that is a recognizing that it's not possible to get it right, and a pitching in and trying anyway. So it's a kind of way of, I suppose what I feel is that there's a kind of way in which you can sort of feel, okay, the space of academic inquiry is a kind of, it's privileged and in some respect insulated from the kind of messiness of the thing that Dryden is engaged with. And we can say that, okay, in this space we have the privilege and the possibility of trying to get it right. If we're really, really careful about what we say, we might say the right thing. And I suppose what I take from Dryden is a sort of ability to both sort of be relaxed about the impossibility of ever saying the right thing, which is to say, okay, I'm going to do something wrong in what I'm saying, as it were. I'm going to fail in what I'm saying. And then a kind of way of a way of inhabiting that kind of messy intellectual space. So thinking of a comparison between the work of translation and my work of criticism takes me in that sort of direction. Okay, thank you.
Well, I know we are all tired. I'm going to try to be brief. I maybe skip some of my paragraph. I will try. My title is maybe misleading publicity because I promised to talk about the Spanish tradition, but I will speak mostly, if not exclusively, about Ortega y Gasset, for one text by Ortega y Gasset. The maneuver that I'm going to make may seem circular, and it is. I don't pretend to make progress on translations theory. I don't pretend to decide or to be conclusive. On the contrary, I will take an errand walk through some landscapes of Ortega's texts, titled Misery and Splendor of Translation, published in 1937 in the Argentinian newspaper La Nación. Specifically, I would like to present two considerations about that text. The first one is at a theoretical level on translation, and to that extent pursues the roots on which his statements about translation are based, a particular conception of language, of communication, meaning, writing, man, and so on. The emphasis will be placed on this first element by means of the analysis of the Ortegan asymptote. The second consideration focuses on the practical dimension of Ortega's text, namely its more prescriptive or normative scope within which we could find something that we could call translatology, even if that is an anachronism, of course. Ortega produced only one text that addresses directly the subject of translation, but his concerns and motivations were never detached from the translational work. He did not practice this occupation himself, with maybe one exception, even though he was fluent in several languages. But he founded and directed the famous Revista del Occidente that we spoke today in the morning. Around the magazine was formed a sort of prestigious school of translators. In this context became possible the translation of a lot of authors, Hegel, Husserl, Russell, Fichte, and so on. Besides that, Ortega wrote prologues for Germans and French and epilogues for the English, with which he supplemented some of the translation of his own work into foreign languages. This way, he was trying to make up for the possible defect that the absence of circunstancia española, Spanish circumstances, may cause to his book and writings. In addition, we could say that also in the shaping of his personal language, he was close to translation. He thinks that escribir bien consiste en hacer continuamente pequeñas erosiones a la gramática. To write well is to make continual incursions into grammar, into established usage, and into accepted linguistic norms. He found different ways to implement this thought. Among them, he borrowed from other languages. He incorporates foreign elements through calques or loans. Ortega's writing on translation is not precisely characterized by its originality. On the contrary, most of his disquisitions are based on German thinkers such as Schleiermacher, Goethe, Humboldt, etc. This text belongs to a period in translation history that focuses on theory and hermeneutic inquiry and that prioritizes two main debates, the possibility and impossibility of translation and the dichotomy between literal and free translation. Ortega's text is in deep depth to this tradition, but his text seems to me worthy of attention for several reasons. First, it has received a lot of attention, deserved or undeserved, and has therefore been translated and widely quoted, at least in the Ibero-American context. Second, because it shows elements of the translational problem that continue to be interesting despite its traditional base. And third, Ortega's conception of humanity and his ethical conviction permeate all his theses about translation. And I could address here something that I realized only during these sessions, and is that the text by Ortega is a pseudo-translation. I didn't notice that before because I didn't have that conceptual device. So that kind of changed everything, but it's amazing, and that caught more my attention. This text is structured as a fictitious dialogue held by academics and students and professors of the Collège de France in Paris. Ortega begins with the exposition of the mysteries of translation, placing the essence of saying in the essence of any act that creates meaning in any semantic act. The act of translating is an impossible exercise and necessarily an utopian task, un afán utópico o una faena utópica. The theses go further. Not only translation is an illusory endeavor, the truth is that everything man does is utopian. Human aims are never reached and human purposes are never totally fulfilled. But this is not his final word. Ortega crowns his text with the splendor of translation. This splendor would be backed up by a utopianism of positive kind, which is based on realism. The good utopian knows that the most desirable things are impossible to attain. They can only be achieved as an approximation to an ideal. In this way, the translation can be a vehicle that brings us closer to the original work without trying to repeat it. Before I can explain what I have anticipated as Ortega's asymptotic solution to the translation problem, I must take a few steps back. Generally speaking, we know that according to Ortega, all valuable and significant human activity is impossible and utopian. But specifically, what it is impossible to translate from one language to another. Ortega follows Humboldt in his idea that languages have an inner form or internal form, derived from people's way of life and their landscape, customs, way of perceiving and experiencing the world. The inner form of languages informs about a worldview, about the peculiar way of representing, thinking, meaning, feeling of a certain group. Reality, for Ortega, is a limitless continuum of diversity. In order to not to get lost in it, we have to slice it, to establish discrete differences. Each language is shaped by a different selective spirit, which acts on vocabulary, syntaxis, and morphology. In this way, language is not only forced to say, but also forced us to be silent. There is a segment of reality that remains untold, not necessarily ineffable, for a community of speakers. That is a shared tacit field. Francisco de Ayala insists on the same point in his book Problem of Translation, which has also published in the form of articles in La Nación 10 years after Ortega's text. I'm quoting, "When we declare desperate the translated effort is by realizing that it consists in operating a transference between two subtly incommunicable words. This is because a literary work is an integrated piece based on the roots of the language within a cultural system to which a dense set of implication is attached. Let us remember that this is compounded by the difficulty that a good writer deviates the ordinary use of language. The already constituted language imposes on its speakers unavoidable categories and root marks, but also the outstanding speakers imposes on the language some form of his own, which later can become part of the anonymous and linguistical web of a culture. What will the translator do with the rebellious text? Ortega claims that probably he will place the translated author in a prison and policy of normal expression. That is, he will betray him. Schleiermacher anticipated these ideas by considering first the specific difference between languages and second, the author's double relationship with his own language. They also refer to Humboldt, of course. According to him, language is a product and also a process of open activity. Furthermore, the task of translation is revealed as an impossible mission in the context of another element of Ortega's theory of language. That is the very fact that the speaking, in the sense of communicating, is also an utopian enterprise. In order to clarify this point, it is useful to refer to the commentary on Plato's Symposium. In this text, Ortega exposes the double condition of speaking and stricto sensu of any semantic and communicative attempt. His axiomatic philology is summarized in two premises. Every saying is deficient because it says less than it intends to communicate, and two, every saying is exuberant because it implies much more than what was intended, even what was voluntary not intended. Basically, the utopian impossibility is the destiny shared by all operations that take place within language. Painting, reading, writing, understanding, speaking. But we could say that translation represents the extreme situation, the epitome and the height of language difficulties. According to Ortega, language is a conglomerate of three elements: a particular tone, situation or context, and gesture. In a written text, words are turned out of their original situation and in all its dimensions, physical, moral, vital, mental. The words also lose the gestual substrate. Perhaps this is why Ortega thinks that reading comprehension is a more painful task than oral comprehension already is. In translation, as in the written word, we certainly lose gesture, corporality, and situation, at least the original context or situation. And here we also lose the original tongue. So what's left to wait for? I perceived Ortega's proposal as an attempt to overcome the mathematical relationship of equivalence or quasi-equivalence, tremendously dominant until then. For this purpose, he replaces the mathematical relationship of equivalence with an asymptotic relation. That is to say, the indefinite approximation to the work without ever reaching it completely. So the translation is not the work, but as he says, a path toward the work. No es la obra, sino un camino hacia la obra. In this line of thought, translation is no more than an apparatus, a technical device that brings us closer to the work without trying to be a double of the original work. It is worth to say that translation itself is not utopian. It actually happens de facto all the time, but takes place in an utopian horizon, as much as it is as an infinite task whose north is a regulating ideal. I believe that the Ortegian utopian program must be read in this regard, an impossibility that's not paralyzed but is permanent activity. I would like to point out what I think are the splendors of Ortega's text. The first thing that must be recognized is that the Ortegan theory, even with its weaknesses and depths, gets to problematize the widespread idea that the translation is or should be a copy, simile, or mimesis of the original. Moreover, thanks to the assimilation of Humboldt's model, he is not naive in relation to the independence of the signified from the signifier. Signified for signifier. In this line, he is capable of subverting translation theory that relies on the transmission of a stable and fixed meaning or content despite the change of containers. In other words, he challenged the idea that the translated text has only superficial losses in expression, in adornment, but recovers the essence of the message. The second splendor of his text has to do with the establishment of an anthropological and ethical project. It is true that Ortega's theory is too general and unspecific. In spite of this, Ortega takes advantage of the problem of translation to underline what really interests him, the human condition. One of his strongest theses, developed in other texts, is that man has no fixed nature, but a historical one, open and under construction. Hence, one of his most famous statements, man has no nature, what he has is history, or human life is a gerund, not a participle, a faciendum, not a factum. The form of life or trajectory is not imposed on man, it's not given, but man has to make his way of life, to choose at every moment. This means that human necessity is the terrible imperative of invention. Therefore, human life is a poetic effort, and translation is not less poetic in that sense. The translator approach to the work can be greater or lesser, and this project projects his activity to infinity. For this reason, translation can be always improved and enhanced. This gives the translator's work an ethical dimension that relates him to the sporting sense of existence. That is, a free effort that rises life above its miseries, making it a noble life. In the effort to carry out impossible projects, man achieves many things. He creates innumerable realities that so-called nature is incapable of producing by itself. In The Revolt of the Masses, Ortega claims that, I'm quoting, nobility is synonymous with a life of effort, ever set on excelling oneself, in passing beyond what one is to what one sets up like a duty and an obligation. In this way, the noble life stands opposed to the common or the inert life, which reclines statically upon itself, condemned to perpetual immobility, unless an external force compels it to come out of itself. End of quote. The translational activity informs about man's autopoietic vocation and his utopian and endless exercise. On the other hand, the awareness of the impossibility of translation puts on the table the irreducibility of the other. The otherness, the foreign, cannot simply be absorbed and made invisible, but there will always remain a noise, a strangeness. Let us now turn to the miseries of Ortega's text. In the first place, although the general treatment of the problem of translation made it possible to introduce reflections of the human condition, its fragility, its vocation for improvement, its desire to overcome itself, it is also true that Ortega's theory is so general, so comprehensive, that in the end, the specificity of translation becomes invisible. By making every human situation impossible and utopian, he somehow ends up hiding or veiling the difficulties inherent of translation. It is true that Ortega thinks through paradoxes as a way of provoking, of taking people out of the commonplace, as a way of avoiding the ready-made opinions and fossilized assumptions, the easy closures that we talked the other day. But it is also true that his text lacks specificity as a theoretical essay about translation. Secondly, I do not agree with Ortega on translating as always and necessarily perfectible, at least not in a different sense as the fact that everything human is perfectible. It is true that translation can have openness and unconclusiveness, unfinished and not definitive tenor, but there are translations as good as they can be. That doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't venture on other ones, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the previous one needed to be overcome or surpassed or enhanced. Ortega himself recognized that progressism and utopianism are the same ism. Evidently, the willingness to progress in Ortega is not simple-minded, confident in something secured. He also believed in retrogression. But the point is that it is not true that translation can always be improved. but they can simply attend or privilege different angles, like Andres showed us, and also Kasia with the multiple translations. The translations can coexist and complement each other synchronously, simultaneously, not necessarily as a diachronic development. They can also obey to, this is obvious, to different contexts, readers, circumstances, and purposes that requires and sometimes demands new and different translations. Sometimes the mere introduction of certain ideas of way of thinking can twist everything and be sabotaged, dangerous, or reactionary. At other times, translation may become tasteless, scholarly, rough, not very accurate, or excessively cultist and academic. Thirdly, if a text from the past can be preserved and is worthwhile, a translation from the past can also be worthwhile. Approaching to a translation of a text is valuable itself, not just as a bridge to the original work. In Ortega's theory, there is an excessive attachment to the original work, to the extent that the significance of translation lies on leading to it, in being a path to it, and it is not valuable as a new experience itself. Ortega has overcome the conception of translation as imitatio and also that of translation and the transfer of a sense, which is independent of its form. However, translation would be no more than a medium with a sui generis status, that does not even share the genre with the original work, which means that according to Ortega, if a poem or a play is translated, the result is not a poem nor a play. Fourthly, one sees how the asymptotic figure, that, as he understands it, entails a degrading conception of translation. The scholar Santoyo rejects Ortega's system for being unoriginal, overvalued, impracticable in most cases, and also for considering that it offers a vision of the translator as a figure that is too spiritless and pusillanimous. Perhaps Santoyo's criticism is not entirely misled. One may think that the asymptotic ideal does not actually separate itself from the ideal of equivalence, but rather to conceals it. It aspires to an equivalence never achieved, never actualized, never always deferred and disappointed, but it aspires to an equivalence in the end, to an identity. It seems to me that if analyzed in a more profound way, Ortega does not reproduce underhand the logic of equivalence, but effectively subvert it, because the translation does not attempt to identify itself with the work, but rather to lead us as a device or a technical tool. However, Ortega replaces equivalence with an ever stricter regimen of univalence or monovalence. The only criterion of definitive and absolute value is given by the original work, of which the translation constitutes a spurious supplement, an artifice to reach it. The original work as a goal, meta, and translation as a method, as a mere instrument, metodo. In this way, he seems to relegate translation in spite of his declaration of intentions. It will be only ancilla textus primigeni. The hermeneutic commitment is key to understand the Ortegian program. The center is placed in the act of understanding, and while neither speaking nor understanding nor reading are possible in the strict sense, the north of the task is placed on comprehension as the basis of translation. Translation aims to reveal, expose, or explain what remains hidden or latent in another language, the secrets of the other languages. The purpose is to unravel what is silenced by the foreign language. Ortega points out that the translation attempts to reveal the mutual secrets that peoples and epochs keep from each other. The reconstruction of the message is fundamental. Without a doubt, Ortega's ideas need to be rethought and problematized. Benjamin, for example, provides an unusual framework in order to enrich and challenge the Ortegian assumptions. But in addition to the fact that I'm ignorant about Benjamin, I also find it interesting to note that there are some clues catered in Ortega's work that allows us not to resolve his problems, but to complicate them a little more. I'm talking about the preeminence of dialogue and historical consciousness in the theory of communication and culture. The unrestricted devotion to the original work and the degradation of translation as a mere path to it and not as a new experience itself stumble when they appear at Ortega's most definite instance for language, dialogue. Dialogue is the essence of the world and informs us about the context, the ground, the shared subsoil, and the presence of an interlocutor of which we don't know how she or he or they will respond. Quoting Ortega, in its strict reality, the logos is very human conversation, dialogos. end of quote. According to him, a book is only good if it offers a latent dialogue, and I add, dialogue is not only a condition of possibility for the appearance of the text, but also a condition for its survival. Translation is a dialogical moment with the work. It makes contacts with the work through the contamination of languages, of space, and often of historical time, with all its implication, the amount of prejudice, resonance, echoes, beliefs, way of thinking and meaning, etc. Dialogue implies mutual transformation and reciprocity, not merely successive interventions. Ortega says, my purpose has been the involution of the book into dialogue. And we could say that to pay attention to the translation of a text is to become more aware of the dialogical dynamism of language, through thought and life. Maybe that is why he wrote precisely a dialogue and not a regular essay to talk about translation. Of course, this is closely related to the concern about the historical circumstance. Not only the vital, intellectual, historical, affective situation of the author is important, but also that of the translator. Texts are historical events, and as such, they obey their epoch and create epoch too, especially when they are good. The same goes for translation, which is in a sense constitute historical moment of the original text because they are part of the history of its continuity, reception, and so on, but they are also irreducible to that work and therefore are founding historical events themselves. As I said in the beginning, I will dedicate a few words, very brief, to Ortega's normative proposal, that is on how to actualize his asymptotic ideal of translation. In addition to the classic binomial possibility-impossibility and some of its variants, Ortega's text is imbued with the practical dichotomy between a free and a literal translation. On this, as in several aspects, Ortega follows Schleiermacher's famous distinction between a translation that moves the reader into the author's language, forcing to delimit the intelligibility of the language and preserving the strangeness that a foreign language always has, and a translation that brings the author into the reader's orbit, make it close and proximate. Ortega opts for the ugly or frightening translation over the translation focused on recognition, along the lines of the traditional and sexist unfaithful beauties versus the ugly but faithful. Ortega believes in removing the reader from his linguistic habits in order to force him to move toward the author's way of meaning, that is, to prepare an attitude of hospitality and not domestication of the foreign, of the other. It is not difficult to realize that the discussion around this methodological alternative, despite being in a traditional and manierist line, crystallizes important dimensions that are at stake in the exercise of translation, for example, a political or social one. In fact, the questions about integration or disintegration of the foreign come on stage. In this context, Ortega's proposal is a gesture of openness, of letting oneself be intervened and moved by another, in a possible reciprocal relationship. The problem is that Ortega does not have in sight a real openness, but rather the use of the original text for instruction or education of the Western man. So it ends up being a controlled assimilation of it. Ortega's intention to use the text is very clear. In one of the most crucial passages of the text, in the section of the splendor of translation, Ortega points out that the excursions or journeys abroad are indispensable for the education of Western men. He's interested in an authentic historical enlightenment. Ortega is looking for a source of learning and knowledge in the past, including other linguistic habits and way of meaning. And I'm not saying that having intention of this kind is bad itself, but it is as an imposition in the approach to the text of the past or from other places on earth, because it rules the way of interacting. It rules the purpose and the result of the interaction. And it ends up looking like a targeted action and not a free interaction. In any case, it is also possible to trace. No, I will skip this paragraph because it's very long. I will just conclude with the last one. Unamuno, I'm trying to trace some attempts to dissolve this opposition between literal and free translation. Unamuno was a very dedicated and devout translator. In one of his letters, he points out that translating is making a new friend. Even though it is an isolated statement without a theory of translation as background, I found the paradigm of friendship for translation very suggestive, and it may be one, not the only one of course, of the ideals to be considered. Good friends know each other intimately and respect, accept, tolerate, and love each other for who they are and also despite who and how they are, in their difference. But they also permeate and contaminate each other by imitation and by adopting similar gestures, opinion, way of speaking, and creating new way of speaking. They create together a common universe. This universe is different from both of them taken separately. Certainly, this is not the only way to think and practice translation, but it might be interesting to contrast it with the imperatives of equality or liberty, to use the mottos of the French Revolution that coincide with literal or free translation. We can draw attention to fraternity, or perhaps better than a brotherhood or sisterhood, to friendship. The end.
Okay, so are there any questions in the room? Yeah.
So I have a question to our two speakers, Matthew and Bea, right? Is it Bea?
Begoña?
Yeah, sorry. So I wanted to ask you about these metaphors of translation, because in both of your papers we had this idea of, in Matthew's paper, well, Matthew's whole project is about prismatic translation, and you mentioned the asymptotic translation. And while these kind of approaches try to, I think, descend from this very normative approach to translation, they also slipped into categories which derive from science, so prism in optics, in physics, and asymptote from maths. And I wonder whether these kind of metaphors are used just because translation can never get away from this normative aspect or scientific aspect, whether you could comment on that. That's my question.
Sorry, yeah. Respondents.
I was counting with some time to think about that, the answer, but...
Or if you want, we can do a round of questions. Maybe.
I can try to respond.
Would you prefer?
There is a question?
Okay, so let's gather two questions. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. I was thinking, it was so interesting, because I was thinking that we haven't changed, you know, if we talk about translation and the paradoxes of translation. For example, when Ortega y Gasset says or talks about the perfectible, right? For example, Savalviascoa says that translation is a human activity, so it's part of the communication. And communication is a human activity. That is why it is not a disgrace to say that translation is not a perfect thing, right? And for example, I was listening to you, and I felt like the myth of the eternal return, because well, I was writing some things here, and I was remember a book written by Cicero in the 1st century before Christ called De Optimo Genere Oratorum. And in that book, he starts the debate between the primary debate of translation, the primary debate, you know, the first one, when we said, for example, the literal translation versus the free translation, and we can see that we have been talking about all these days, and we never end, you know, because it is too much difficult to finish this conversation. For example, when we talk about the foreignizing versus hospitality, well, creative and uncreative, possibility versus impossibility, or for example, I was thinking about the Baba's translation, you know, and when we said, and I agree when you translated with the it, with the neutral it, and I think it's okay because it is part of a free translation, and there is an author called von Flotow that in 1991 gave us 5 strategies to translate things related to gender you know? And then we can use the neutralization or generalization as a free way to translate gender. So I was thinking, maybe it's not a question, but I was thinking this, this problem that will never end, you know, related with the first or the primary debate of translation that starts with Cicero. And it's very interesting because translation can be our love, but it can also be our suffering, our eternal suffering, I think. Thank you.
Okay. So there, Moritz?
I've got two half-baked questions for Pablo. I mean, thank you all for your incredible presentations. I feel like I've gone through a tour de force, so I'm regathering my self. So two questions, Pablo. The first, and they both have to do with, I guess, limits. The first, I was fascinated when you were speaking of translation and decision, a decision at every moment, and so then it's a hesitation. And I was thinking about Benjamin's critique of violence and the way he describes the violence of the police, which seems to be a limit of that hesitation that you're putting forward in translation, because that's almost the sovereignty of decision in every moment done by the police, right? So I was wondering about that connection on the one hand, and then the other, when you were talking about sufficient cause and then into God, I thought of Spinoza and his idea of sufficient cause and then his idea of the eternal love of God. Obviously in Spinoza, God is not over there, yeah. So I wonder how that would connect in with your argument on translation.
So maybe we could, so you could answer those questions and then we continue. So, anyone wants to start?
I will be very brief because I need time to digest and process. I'm not a good immediate responder. About the first question, it is a math metaphor, of course, but I was thinking in the same area that identity or equivalence, that is also a math metaphor, and I just keep in that area to think about translation. I think that it's a very useful metaphor, but it's a metaphor, and as a metaphor, it has its limits. It has its fruitful and useful considerations that we can make regarding a metaphor, but it also we need to know when to stop using a metaphor and to know its limits. So I'm responding very bad, but I don't know if you understand me. Okay. And about the second commentary question, I think that we are stuck into this contradiction and oppositions, to these paradoxes. Maybe we can change our way to relate to these paradoxes and not. We are thinking in dialectical concepts, but maybe we're not making synthesis every time, and we're not choosing between them. We are trying to sophisticate or refine our way to deal with these paradoxes. And we are not just decide for one and another or make a synthesis of both. That.
So yeah.
So it's just about metaphors really. So about the particular prismatic metaphor, I don't like it much either, and it came about. I mean, initially I wanted to use the rainbow. I wanted it to be rainbow translation, but then we felt the rainbow was kind of taken as a metaphor already, and there was a phase when I was saying, no, I really want to call it rainbow translation. Anyway, I can't remember if it was you, Adrian, who said, somebody said, no, you really can't. You have to think of something different. So then the prism emerged. I mean, and so, you know, as with any metaphor, it's obviously inadequate. What I like about it is that it has the idea of kind of splitting and creating multiplicity. And also, in a way, I quite like the obvious inadequacy about it, which is to say that you have to say, well, okay, you don't just have one white light going into them, and then you have to say, well, okay, there are many things feeding into it, as many coming out, so there's that. Just generally about metaphors, I mean, none of the metaphors fit. Everything we can say about translation is metaphorical. The idea of literal is metaphorical, the idea of free is metaphorical, etc. And so what I like about Dryden, as I hope I showed, is that what you can see in him really clearly is the way in which you've got these descriptive terms, which are the only descriptive terms we have. The only descriptive terms we have are inadequate, and so what follows from that is an issue of practice, which is to say, how do you use them? And what I like about the way he uses them is that they sort of, it's kind of almost a little bit like some aspects of Derrida's style in a way, they almost kind of unravel in the moment of their utterance. So you've got this feeling of him saying, okay, I'm going to go with this for a bit, but obviously then I'm not, there's something different going on. So I really like the idea, there's this kind of, and this is really the opposite of the way that people, the figure that he cuts in the world of translation studies really at the moment, which is to say, I think if you pay attention to, what's going on in his style, it's really obvious to me that he realizes that he's dealing with something that he can't grasp, and that all the time you've got this sort of sketching of it or creating of silhouettes of the thing that is happening. So why can't it be grasped? And that's because everything here is co-created. Nothing here exists. There is no original. There's nobody, and this is why it goes into a theory of the subject, as Pablo said. There's no there's nobody doing the translation. There's no target text. There's no source text either. And I think one of the things that really happens with the language people use about translation is that a kind of basic language that has a certain value when you're doing exercises in school, or when you're concerned with language learning or that kind of thing, or when you're making a rough categorization about whether it's literal or free, and that's about, okay, how am I going to use it? So quite a rough language gets sort of stuck. It gets established in the way people think about it. And really what we need, so, I mean, the thing about closeness, there's nothing to be close. I mean, so what's really weird is that things that everyone, sort of understands about text in general sort of drop away when you're in the sphere of discursive translation. So, the word original, which people still use, where does anyone use that word except in the discourse of translation still? And it's because, yes, so the thing to grasp is that there's no source text. I mean, there's a source text, but there's no original. There's no work there because everyone is obviously reading it in a different way. We understand that. So that the work of translation is a work of co-creation. You're reading it and translating it and producing another text at the same time, and the text you produce then has to be read. So everything is fluid. And so, in a way, and the terms that we have for describing that can't cope with that. So really, that's why I'm completely incapable of theorizing the subject. But I mean, that's why it's completely right to think that as soon as you're looking at translation, you have to go to that kind of level of philosophical complexity, because that's what's going on, really. Yeah. Over to you for that one, Pablo.
Okay. Thank you, Moritz, for both questions. The first one, I find it a marvelous contrast between the police and the translation. It's fantastic. Particularly when you pay attention to the, you were asking me to pay attention to this aspect of the at any moment, and the police effectively act at any moment. The police, as Benjamin presents this, how does it say, this spectral institution. The point is that you say that this is a limit to hesitation. And yes, of course, it is a limit of hesitation. And maybe you could say that the limit of hesitation is violence. It's precisely what police do is violence. It's violence in a very particular way, because if I remember well, Benjamin says that with the police, the difference between law-making and law-preserving violence is suspended. So both, the action of the police is both things at a time. But they are both things in a very particular way that I think that this has to do with the problem of the subject too, because when the police acts violently, it is always on behalf of the law, but on behalf of a law that is instituted by this very action. No? It's a law that doesn't exist previously. No? Or maybe it's a translation of a law, a violent translation of a law that previously was there. But the point I was wanting to underline was that in this action, in this suspension of both types of both kinds of violence, lawmaking and law preserving, the police doesn't act as a subject, but as a surrogate of the sovereign, and that's very curious. No? It is also a sort of effacement of the subject, but an effacement of the subject that invokes this super subject that is the sovereign. No? And this way of a kind of replacement, a kind of substitution, a kind of this spectral substitution. I think that the point about the spectre in Benjamin has to do something with this. Well, I don't know if I am answering your question. And the second question, that's a very tricky question for me. That, yeah, Spinoza's God and Malebranche's God. You know that I love three concepts in philosophy, and I always say that there are only three concepts in philosophy that are absolutely inventions. And I mentioned two of them, and I have to mention the third one. The two of them are the Kleinerman, the occasion, and the conatus. So these are my beloved concepts in philosophy. So I would put the, you know that all these concepts are concepts that are tributary, you say tributary? Tributary, yeah, tributary to the theory of causality. And this is a point that is particularly interesting in the possibility of making some connections between them, of establishing some similarities, so to say, between them. But of course, there are also differences that are absolutely perhaps unsurmountable in certain aspects of these concepts. And I mean these. What I was doing with Malebranche's God was trying to, could you say, immanentize him, to bring this God, this transcendent God, this absolutely efficacious God, to the immanence of this task that is translating. Yeah. And precisely as a task, I would say, translation has, I'm returning to the first question, translation has an absolutely different relationship with the law as the police has. But I cannot say any more about that second question. So, thank you.
Gabriel, you had a question? Yes.
It's a question also inspired by Pablo's talk, but I want to open it to a more general question about translation and the creative process. I was thinking about it when, in relation to your concept of translation as a constant hesitation at every moment. And I was wondering what would be an alternative movement, namely translation as an unconscious flow from within and toward a different mode of being in language. And I'm thinking about this coming from my own experience at translating. I realized at one point, I started out with that mode of hesitation at every moment, trying to translate word by word, sentence by sentence, and then I realized I needed to free myself from that, read a paragraph very intensely, then step back and transpose it into a different mode of being in language, but then in a secondary process of working through, the hesitation at every moment comes in. But it's kind of, the first move would be more along the lines, if I think in terms of theories of creativity, along the lines of unconscious scanning. And the second, the hesitation of every moment would be a conscious working through and a conscious scanning. But I realized if I tried to make this the primary move, the translation itself becomes too mechanistic. I'm even thinking, you know, you use the translation machine as a metaphor. I think if I take the translation machine in a Deleuze-Guattari sense, I can actually link it to more an unconscious process of translation as a first initial thing. I'll stop here, I could say.
Okay, there's another question, Millet?
Sure, thank you. I'm still processing the 3 talks, and so my question is not very well formulated. But in thinking about the theory of decision in both the space of translation and sovereignty, translation immediately sort of gives the image of the 2 languages, and hesitation as a space that is possible between those heterogeneous sets, as you mentioned. I am struck by the singularity of sovereignty in the scene of the heterogeneity of. So I was wondering, not only also in relationship to Schmidt's political theology and the political, but also if we thought we'd know most of the earth, where you have a distribution of sovereignties that are, what would that open up? But that's just mostly a thought. I was wondering if you could say a little more about the hesitation, whether how we understand it, and is that. I could understand it in a very secular, straightforward way. I could understand it also in theological way. Is hesitation a secularized theological concept? What kind of assumptions about time does it? Do we rely on the future that would necessarily be guaranteed? God is not going to strike and this would be the end of time, so there is no time to hesitate? Something like that. Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? There, Jane.
Just to add just a little bit to that, Pablo, could you also, because at the beginning you talked a lot about Schmitt, and then Heidegger kind of flew by there, and you juxtaposed political theology to, I think what you said was ontological politics or something like that in terms of Heidegger, and I think that that's actually might be related to, so if you could swing back through Heidegger, just briefly.
Just briefly.
And Pramesh?
Just a small question for Matthew. So I also enjoyed all the papers, but I wanted to ask Matthew to just think a little bit further along on inhabiting the messiness of failure, and what do you imagine is possible in the kind of in that formulation?
Okay. So, Paolo, want to answer? We have 4 questions. Or Matthew, maybe, I don't know.
Okay.
Let's see.
Well, first, Gabriele's question. Well, I agree completely with you. I know that I have exaggerated the point about hesitation and the point about this. I agree with this is something like an unconscious flaw, and like this kind of this mode of being in language. You know? But I have to make a confession about that. This is also, I think Hande said the other day, on Wednesday, that to take recourse to our own experience is the worst argument. So if this is the case, I have to speak about my own experience as translator. You know that there are some very disoriented people, Friends mainly, who think that my translation of Kant's Third Critique is the best of all 4 translations in Spanish. But and the point is that I translated the Third Critique according to this mode of being. Particularly the second, I didn't understand anything about the second part of the Third Critique, about the critique of theological judgment when I was translating it. I understood it afterwards. Ja. Das ist nachträglich, so Freudian Nachträglichkeit. And that's because I think that translating in the first place is this kind of almost transcription from one language to the other. Not a translation, properly talking, but a transcription from one language. At least this is my experience. And as I say, I have normally I have not read the text. I will translate. I don't have any notice about this thing. But this is I say this is personal experience, and I cannot universalize this. I cannot generalize this experience. But I think that it has a certain point that you were talking about, a certain point that is interesting that you were talking about. That is this first mode of being in language. Of course, there is a second mode of. You cannot translate without this second mode of being, but I would like to think of the second mode as in this, according to this concept of Nachträglichkeit, this coming back. I would say coming back to the trauma, something like that. Yeah? To the first trauma, that is this first mode of being in language. It has a certain traumatic condition that I would say that. And I think that translation makes this apparent, so makes this appear, this curiously traumatic mode of being in language. So, and this could be also a mode of addressing the point about hesitation. I think that your question is particularly difficult to understand, because you have also mentioned the sovereign about this point of hesitation. But I think that I was talking. If I try to understand what I was talking about when I was talking about hesitation, I think I was talking about hesitation in the most common way of experiencing hesitation. But the point is that when you experience this hesitation, according to in the process of translating, in this kind of at any moment, it takes another appearance, hesitation, and this is what I was trying to point to. I always have a horrible inhibition when it comes to speaking other languages, even in my second language, which is German. So, again, no, I was trying to say this: the point of hesitation in the process of translation that interests me is that it, in a certain way, undermines our experience of decision, or better said, shows us the truth of decision. And this truth of decision is something that is incompatible with what, for instance, Schmidt names sovereignty, and which I think is also present in Heidegger, clearly present in Heidegger. So this is what I can say. Sorry, yes, Jane, please.
So I'm sorry, I actually thought you were distinguishing between Schmidt and
Yeah,
Heidegger.
between Schmidt and Heidegger.
Right,
yeah,
and so
yeah.
when I think of somebody saying something about the being in language, that is that immediacy of being in language, and that you were, and that the moment of hesitation is being in language, that actually seems quite Heideggerian to me, and so I was wondering what your stance, whether your reading of hesitation as a kind of counter-sovereignty argument wasn't actually slightly Heideggerian.
Yeah, I would say that hesitation has to do with unintentionality. There's no intention in hesitation. It's a sort of suspension of intention, and for that very reason, it is also it also is non-teleological. You have no this is not hermeneutical. It's absolutely not hermeneutical. You have no idea what is the end of the phrase you are beginning to translate, so to say. This is a difference important with Heidegger, who always has, of course, he has this authoritative tenor in his work, but also this teleological tenor in his work. I know that is. I know that is doubtful. But that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Okay. Maybe I could, if I just a little bit in response to Gabriele, and then and then work around towards Premish's point. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right about hesitation, the unconscious. I mean, the translation just happens. It's not that, and this is in line with what Pablo's been saying, it's not that anyone decides anything. I sort of hesitate about, I mean, obviously it's in continuity with the unconscious, and this is like it's like any writing. It's perhaps a bit more like creative writing than it depends how the academic writing is going, doesn't it? How that comes about. But I mean, any writing, has texts feeding into it and is done by a human being who's kind of, variously aware of what's going on. But it just happens. And I suppose I think of translation as being a kind of writing that is, continuous with all those kinds of writing, in that it's got text feeding into it and it just happens. But it's just a particularly regulated kind, and it's a particularly regulated kind because there's a there's a special kind of discipline that it's subjected to, and a special, there's more of one text feeding into what's happening and more of one text that's coming out, and an expectation of a relationship between them. But it is, and then I think one of the things that puzzles me is why people persist in using such inadequate terms. Why people persist in using terms like closer or freer, given that you can't ever, as Pablo's been elaborating, you can't ever know whether it's closer or not. I actually love the idea when people say that translation, the sort of, okay, what are the cliches of translation? Every translation is an interpretation, translation is impossible, etc., etc. But how do you know? And so nobody, what's being translated is not just the words, obviously. There's a work being made interpretatively out of the words on the page by every reader. And then if the idea of, and you can't know what that is. I can't know how someone else reads. I can't know what the thing is that somebody else is translating because it's made imaginatively out of that process. And it seems to me entirely possible that when I read a translation, actually the thing that happens in my mind could be exactly the same as what happens when a Roman read Virgil, but there's just no way of knowing. Do you see what I mean? So that whole, and obviously it can also be completely different, but there's just no way of making that judgment. And yet people carry on using those words. And then that's just an example of sort of rough and ready words. Okay, there's a sense in which, in a very rough and ready way, they have meaning, those words, are sort of being pushed the whole time to do work that they can't do. And this brings me back to the sort of, the kind of messiness of failure. And I suppose this is, I don't really have a very developed response to this, except to say that I'm interested in different kinds of a sort of authority that people are expected to take on, and different kinds of criticism that they're subjected to, which is to say that I've had some extremely bad reviews for my work in many genres, but there's a particular kind of bad review that translators get subjected to, which is to say they get told they've just done something wrong, they've just failed in the thing they were doing, that we tend not to get subjected to. So there's I think there's a kind of space of safety in a way around what we do, but then on the other hand, I don't feel that actually very much about us. I think we're quite a nice group, but I feel that, in academia in general, I'm very uneasy about. Oxford University is all about being an expert in things, and I'm really uneasy about adopting the position of the expert or the person who knows. And I'm generally quite uneasy about the way people sort of adduce authorities, because that's a kind of really shorthand translation. And obviously in dialogue here we've been engaging with each other's use of authorities, and that's all. But that's fine. I think that's how it should be, really. But I suppose in a way it's so. What I was trying to get at there was a feeling that so every translator knows this kind of thing that Dryden knows, I think. Every translator knows there's a sort of mismatch between what they've been doing and the sort of myth, I suppose, that gets imposed on them, the sort of expectation of equivalence or the expectation of correctness. Or every translation knows that what they're doing is full of mistakes. And I'm sort of interested in. So I suppose what I was thinking about is that as I don't know. I'm sort of interested in the relationship between that way of inhabiting an identity, a professional identity, and our ways of inhabiting a professional identity. But I don't have anything more developed than that to offer. Sorry.
Are there any other questions? No? Okay, so yeah, let's finish. Thank you.